Wyoming Territory, August 1887, the sky turned orange before the fire reached the house. From his saddle, Jesse Porter caught the sharp flicker of flame through the cottonwoods and kicked his horse hard toward the smoke. He was coming back from the North Ridge after running fence line, sweat still clinging to his shirt, the sun barely dipping behind the hills. What should have been a quiet ride turned into something else entirely. By the time he reached the edge of the Nels home, fire had chewed through the roof and black smoke poured out the windows. The barn behind it was untouched, but the house itself. It was going fast. "Help!" A woman's voice, raw and terrified, cut through the crackle of flames. He dismounted in a rush and ran toward the front steps, boots thudding against dry earth. A second later, the front door slammed open. A woman stumbled out, coughing, face smeared with soot, arms shielding her head from falling embers. She looked back inside like someone was still in there. Jesse grabbed her arm. "Anyone else in there?" She shook her head, gasping. "No, just me. I fell asleep." "Stove caught," she coughed hard, stumbling. The roof groaned above them. He pulled her away just as the chimney gave out and half the front wall collapsed in a spray of sparks. They fell to the dirt together, his arm wrapped tight around her shoulders, shielding her from the heat. Her breath caught, and she clung to him like someone who had nothing left to hold. Only then did Jesse see her face clearly soot-streaked, yes, but beneath it, fine-boned and sharp-eyed. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, her hair falling loose from its pins. She looked up at him with wide green eyes, red-rimmed from smoke. He helped her sit upright, brushing ash from her shoulder. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head again, slower this time. "No, just dizzy." They sat in silence a moment, watching the fire eat what was left of the house. The woman stared straight ahead, jaw tight. "I've got water in my saddlebag," Jesse said, standing to grab it. He brought it back and handed her the canteen. She drank, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything," Jesse said simply. She looked at him then, really looked. Her voice was quiet, but there was something heavy behind it. "Why would you risk yourself for me?" Jesse glanced at the burning house, then back at her. "Because you were in there." She blinked, as if that answer wasn't enough, but it was all he had. "You see someone in danger, you go, that was it." "I'm Jesse Porter," he added after a pause. She gave a soft nod. Evelyn Nels. He'd heard the name before. Everyone in the county knew the Nels family had come west from Missouri. Her father died of pneumonia 2 winters ago and her mother passed just last spring, but he had not known Evelyn still lived out here alone. "I can take you back to my place," Jesse offered. "You need somewhere to stay." "I cannot leave," she said quickly, looking at the smoking ruin. "Everything I had was in there. You will not have anything left if you stay." She hesitated, fingers tightening around the canteen. "I have an extra room," Jesse said. "You can stay until you figure something out." Evelyn looked back at the house, then at him. She nodded once, slowly. They rode in silence. She sat stiffly on his horse, behind him, her hands light against his waist. He could feel the worn tension in her limbs, the way she held herself like someone trying not to break. His cabin was half an hour's ride south, tucked against a line of hills. Modest, but solid. Evelyn slipped off the horse before he could help her, standing unsteadily as she looked around. He opened the door, then stepped back so she could go in first. "It is not much," he said, "but it's warm, safe." She nodded again, quiet. He showed her the back room. She leaned against the wall for a moment, then turned back. "I do not know how to repay you." "You do not have to," Jesse said, meeting her eyes. "I am just glad you are alive." Her eyes softened, and for a moment she looked like she might cry, but she did not. Instead, she nodded again and disappeared into the room. That night, Jesse sat by the fire, boots beside the hearth, a book open in his lap but unread. He could hear Evelyn moving quietly behind the door. He wondered what she was thinking, what she had lost. He thought of the way she had looked at him by the burning house. Like she could not believe he had come for her. He had not thought twice. The next morning, she was already up when he came back in with firewood. She had braided her hair, washed the soot from her face, and stood by the stove in a borrowed shirt of his, sleeves rolled up. She turned when she heard the door. "I hope it is all right," she said. "I wanted to make something, but you are rather low on supplies." He smiled faintly. "I was not planning on company." "I understand." She turned back to the stove, hands steady. He could see the curve of her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened when she thought no one was looking. After breakfast, she stood at the window for a long time. "It is strange," she said softly, "how fast everything can go, just gone." "You can start again," Jesse said. She looked over her shoulder. "Not everyone gets the chance." "You do." Her eyes held his for a long time. "Because of you," he nodded, not looking away. "Because of me." That afternoon, Evelyn helped him haul water from the creek. She did not talk much, but he did not mind. He liked the quiet between them. It was the kind that said things without needing words. As the sun set and the hills turned gold, she stood beside him, her skirts brushing his leg, her hands wet from the bucket. She turned toward him, her voice low. "You could have let me die." He faced her. "I didn't want to." Her lips parted slightly. She took a step closer. "Why?" "Because I saw you," he said. "And I knew I could not just ride by." Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. Instead, she reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. "Thank you," she whispered. He held her hand quietly, the air between them still. The fire, the smoke, the fear, it was behind them now, and in its place something new was forming. Something steady. Something real. Neither of them said anything more that night. But when she passed him by the hearth, she let her hand brush his. And Jesse, for the first time in a long while, felt something in his chest settle. He had saved her from the fire. But maybe, just maybe, she would save him from something else. The next morning brought wind down from the mountains, dry and sharp, scouring the last of the ash smell from Jesse's yard. A cotton sheet Evelyn had washed flapped on the line, and Jesse stood by the corral, checking a split in the fence rail. The mare nosed at his shoulder, and he let her, distracted by the memory of Evelyn's hand brushing his the night before. She stepped outside not long after, her boots crunching softly over the frost-hardened dirt. She'd hemmed the sleeves of his shirt, stitched the tear in her skirt, and bound her hair with a strip of muslin she must have found in the sewing box. He watched her glance toward the hills, brow furrowed not at the landscape but at something further off, behind her eyes. "Does the town still have a post office?" she asked, her voice even. He nodded. "At the Mercantile. Would you mind riding in with me today? I have kin in Cheyenne, a cousin. I should write to let her know I'm all right." Jesse leaned his weight on the fence rail. "I'll saddle the horses." She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased. The ride into town was quiet, though not strained. They rode side by side, and Jesse noticed Evelyn no longer kept her distance in the saddle. Her hands were sure on the reins, back tall. She still wore the same borrowed shirt and skirt, but she wore them like armor now, instead of remnants. At the general store, she bought paper and ink with coins from a small pouch she kept tied beneath her skirt. She wrote seated on a bench outside, slow and deliberate, her head bent low. Jesse didn't ask what she wrote. He waited while she sealed the letter and handed it off to the clerk inside. When she stepped back outside, Jesse tipped his hat. "Anything else you need?" She hesitated, then nodded once. "A new kettle. And thread. If it's not too dear." They walked the aisles together. She ran her fingers over a tin basin, her touch light, before moving on. Jesse picked up the kettle she'd looked at and carried it to the counter. She didn't object, but she didn't thank him either. He figured she knew better than to insult a man's pride by offering coins he wouldn't take. Outside, she paused beside the horses. "Why don't you talk much?" Jesse adjusted the saddle cinch. "Most folks talk enough for two." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her then, the wind tugging at a loose strand of her hair. "Words don't fix much, Evelyn, never have." She studied him for a long moment. "No, but they can name things. And sometimes just naming a thing lets you live with it." They rode back slower than they'd come. A hawk circled overhead, and the air held the scent of sun-warmed sage. When they reached the cabin, Jesse unsaddled the horses while Evelyn carried the new kettle inside. By the time he came in, she'd already filled it and set it on the stove. "I learned to read from a preacher's wife," she said, not looking up. "She used the Bible and a broken copy of Pilgrim's Progress, told me if I could read, I'd never be helpless." Jesse hung his hat by the door. "She was right. She was halfway mad," Evelyn said, a dry edge to her voice. "But she meant well." They ate together. The stew was thin but hot. Afterward, Jesse sat by the fire mending a bridle strap, and Evelyn stood by the window, arms folded. "I dreamed last night," she said quietly, "that I was still in the house, that I couldn't get out." He didn't respond, just kept threading the needle through the leather. "I woke with the smell of smoke in my nose," she said. "I thought it was real." He tied off the stitch, then set the strap aside. "It's not real now." "No," she said, voice softer. "But it was." The silence stretched between them like the slow drift of snow falling in shadow. Then she crossed the room and sat across from him. "I don't want to stay here out of gratitude," she said. "I don't want to be pitied," he met her gaze. "I wouldn't keep you here if that's all it was." "I know." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're not helpless, Evelyn, you never were." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I've never had a place that didn't cost me something. You have one now," he said. "If you want it." The fire cracked softly. Evelyn's eyes searched his, slow and careful, as though weighing something she hadn't yet dared hope for. "I do," she said. Then she stood, and without hesitation this time she reached for his hand. Not in thanks, not in fear, just in quiet certainty. And Jesse, for once, didn't need words. The days shortened. By early September, the wind carried a bite and the aspens up the ridge began to yellow. Evelyn took to the work without hesitation. She rose before the sun, carried water, split kindling, and mended what needed mending with a silent steadiness that matched the rhythm of the land. Jesse watched her shoulder into the work like someone who'd had no choice but to keep going long before the fire ever touched her. One afternoon, Jesse came back from the southern pasture with his shirt stuck to his back and dust in his teeth. He found her kneeling in the garden bed he'd long given up on. The soil was poor clay and scattered rock, but she'd turned it all with a spade and laid out neat rows. Beside her, a small sack of wild onion bulbs and a handful of corn kernels waited to be planted. "You plan on coaxing something out of that patch?" Jesse stepped over a ridge of earth, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I intend to try." She didn't stop working, just glanced up once to meet his eye. "We had worse soil down near Sedalia, and my mother still made carrots take." He leaned against a fence post. "You always this stubborn?" "I prefer determined." She kept digging, sleeves rolled past her elbows, earth packed under her fingernails. There was no pause for praise, no glance to see if he was impressed. She simply did what needed doing. Later that evening, Jesse found her by the creek, kneeling to wash the dirt from her hands. The light was low, turning the surface copper. She didn't move when he approached, only said, "You were raised here, near enough. My folks had a place west of Buffalo, sold it after the war ended." Evelyn dipped her hands again. "Did you fight?" He sat on a flat stone beside her. "Cavalry. Missouri and Tennessee mostly. My father was conscripted when I was 8, never came back." She glanced at the water. "He didn't talk much either before he left. My mother said some men bring the war home even if their body doesn't." Jesse didn't answer. The current moved slow and steady between them. She looked over. "Do you think men like you are meant to be alone?" "I don't know what I'm meant to be." "Neither do I." A silence settled. Not uncomfortable, just full. The kind of quiet that held more than could be said out loud. That night, Evelyn cooked rabbit, seasoned with the last of the dried thyme she'd found in the back cupboard. They ate on the porch. The sky had turned to velvet, stars pricking through one by one. Jesse listened to the sound of her chewing, the scrape of her fork against the tin plate. It was the kind of domestic hush he hadn't known he missed. Afterward, she leaned back against the porch beam, arms around her knees. "I used to think I'd marry a banker," she said, not looking at him. "A man with a pressed collar and clean fingernails who could read Latin and quote the law." Jesse gave a soft huff. "You change your mind." "I changed." She looked over. Do you think we become different people after something like a fire? I think we become more ourselves, he said. The rest burns off. She nodded slowly, then reached over and took his hand, not tentative, not testing, just sure. Her fingers were rough but warm. I'm not afraid anymore, she said. Not of the dark, not of the quiet. Jesse turned his palm to meet hers fully. You don't have to be. She didn't speak again. Neither of them did. But she stayed there beside him long after the cold crept in and the wind picked up along the eaves. And when she finally stood, she didn't go to the back room. She followed him inside and stayed. By the second frost, Evelyn had taken to humming while she worked, soft melodies Jesse didn't recognize, likely brought west in her mother's voice and kept tucked inside ever since. She sang them under her breath while she patched the wool blanket with the last of the blue thread, or while she scrubbed the ash ring from the kettle's belly beside the stove. Jesse didn't ask her to stop. He felled a young pine that week, stripping its branches clean and laying the trunk to cure for firewood. Evelyn stood nearby, sleeves rolled, gathering the smaller limbs for kindling. She didn't flinch at the sound of the axe anymore. He caught her watching him once, her gaze steady, thoughtful, but she said nothing. That night, the wind kicked up harder than usual, rattling the window panes and whistling through the gaps in the walls. Jesse found Evelyn kneeling beside the hearth, arranging cedar bark and pine cones in the firebox. She didn't look up. I used to listen for the wind like it was an omen, she said. Back in Missouri, it meant something was coming, tornado, storm, men with rifles. After a while, I couldn't tell the difference. Jesse crouched beside her and added a log to the stack she'd built. There's not much to fear here. There's always something, she said, but I don't wait for it the same way anymore. They sat back as the flames caught. The firelight moved across her face, casting shifting shadows along her cheekbones and the curve of her mouth. I keep thinking about what I'll plant in spring, she said after a while. If the garden holds, I want beans, maybe some squash, something that climbs. He nodded. That corner by the fence might get enough sun early on. Her eyes found his. You'd let me stay that long? You already are. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. When I was small, I used to think I'd end up in a town, married to someone who didn't make me feel anything at all, just safe. That was enough then, safety. And now I want the kind of quiet that doesn't hide anything, just lets you breathe. Jesse felt something shift in his chest. Not sudden but certain, like wind changing direction after days of holding steady. I've never asked you what you lost, she said, voice low, back then. He didn't answer right away. The fire popped, sending a sharp spark upward. Brothers, he said finally. Two, both younger, I came back. They didn't. Evelyn's hand settled on his, not tentative, not seeking comfort, just presence. I won't ask again, she said, but thank you for telling me. They stayed by the fire until the wood burned down to coals. When she stood, she didn't go far. Just stepped to the window and looked out into the dark. I've been carrying a bag packed for leaving since I was 15, she said. Even when I wasn't going anywhere. You can put it down now. She turned slowly, her face unreadable in the low light. Do you really mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. She crossed back to him, the boards creaking beneath her boots. She stopped close, the scent of wood smoke soft in her hair. Then I'll stay, she said, and laid her hand flat against his chest. Jesse covered it with his own. No rush, no need to name it out loud. The fire had already done that for them, burned away what didn't matter, left only what did. And this him, the quiet between was what remained. The first snow came early that year, drifting down in slow, deliberate flakes that clung to the bare cottonwood branches and softened the sharp edges of the world. Jesse watched it fall from the porch, a slow curl of steam rising from the coffee tin in his hands. Inside, Evelyn was stitching a new hem on the curtain she'd made from an old flour sack. She hummed something unfamiliar, tapping her heel against the floorboard in time. He didn't tell her, but her presence had taken root in him like something planted deep, quiet, steady, and growing stronger every day. When she came to the door, tying off her thread, she leaned beside him and watched the snow gather across the ridge. "I was thinking," she said. "Next week, I could ride into town. The widow at the mercantile offered me a spool of blue calico for the rest of that wild onion I brought in, said it might suit for a Sunday dress." Jessie glanced at her. "You'd trade that for fabric? I've had enough of storing things I never wear." She took a sip from the tin he passed her. "Besides, I aim to be useful, not just warm. You've been more than useful." She tipped her head, considering. "I'd like to make the dress anyway, not for Sunday." "Just for myself," he nodded. "Then you should." She looked at him then. "Would you come with me? I'd go anywhere you asked." The words settled between them, firm and earnest. She didn't answer right away, only pressed the tin back into his hand and stepped down into the snow, her boots leaving crisp outlines in the white. Jessie watched her walk toward the barn to check the feed, a faint line of steam rising from her breath. That evening, she opened a box he hadn't seen her touch before. From it, she pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. She smoothed it out on the table and stared at it for a long time before speaking. "My father wrote this before he left." "I never showed it to anyone." Jessie didn't reach for it. He waited. "He said he hoped I'd find something still worth believing in." She looked up. "I think I have." She didn't cry. She folded the letter again and slid it back into the box. The next day they rode to town together. She wore her shawl pinned with one of her mother's old brooches and sat straight-backed in the saddle. At the mercantile, she traded the onions and an extra bundle of dried mint for the calico. Jessie stood beside her as she chose the fabric, not speaking, just being there. When they stepped out, the sky had turned a pale blue, the kind that only came after a clean snow. Evelyn handed him the parcel, and he held it like something precious. On the ride back, her horse startled at a broken limb hidden beneath the snow. Jessie caught her reins before she tipped and steadied her with one hand at her waist. She looked over her shoulder, breath caught. "You always catch me," she said. "I always will." She didn't speak again, but her hand came to rest lightly over his where it held the reins. That night she sewed by lamplight, the calico spread across her lap. Jessie watched the rhythm of her needle, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips parted slightly in thought. "Do you miss the life you had before?" she asked without looking up. "No," she paused. "Not even a little. There's nothing behind me I'd trade for what's here." She set the fabric down. "Do you mean me?" "I do." She stood barefoot on the worn rug and crossed to him. "Then tell me what kind of life you want." Jessie took her hands. "One with you in it." She leaned in slowly, like testing the edge of something sacred. When her lips met his, it wasn't hurried. It was sure. The kind of kiss that felt like a promise kept. That winter, they cleared the north fence together when it buckled under the snow. She stitched curtains for every window. He built a shelf for her seeds and carved her a spindle from a fallen aspen. They spoke less of what had been and more of what could be. In March, they rode to the preacher's cabin on the far ridge and stood beneath a bare-limbed tree while he read from a thin, cracked Bible. Evelyn wore the blue calico. Jessie wore his father's coat. They exchanged vows with hands clasped and eyes steady. There were no guests, just the wind and the sky and the sound of their own quiet joy. They returned home by sundown. Evelyn unpinned her shawl and hung it by the door. Jessie took her hand and led her to the hearth, where the fire had already begun to burn low. She turned to him. "This is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged." Jessie drew her close. "Then you're home." And she was. Through spring, she planted the garden with beans and squash and a row of sunflowers along the fence. Jessie plowed new furrows with the mule he borrowed from a neighbor. They built a shed for tools, mended the roof, watched the creek swell with snowmelt. In summer, she laid out the edges of a quilt. He built a bench beneath the cottonwood where they'd sit in the evening, her head sometimes resting against his shoulder. The hush between them filled with the chirr of crickets and the low wind across the grass. When fall came again, the aspens turned gold once more, and Evelyn stood beside Jessie beneath the same tree where they'd spoken their vows. Her hands rested over the small curve of her belly. He kissed her temple. "We'll make a good life for them," she smiled. "We already are, and they did." A life built not from rescue but from the slow work of choosing each other, day after day. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures, only the quiet certainty of belonging, earned and kept, and together they stayed through every season that followed.